question, I would just ask that you please use the mic.
Thanks, Richard. Really enjoyed that. I wonder if you don't make a sharp enough distinction between a law and politics divide. So it seems to me that there are some fundamental differences between formal and informal amendments as they would play out in at least the Canadian context. So let's imagine that the powers of reservation and disallowance were formally removed from the constitutional text. Well, now any government that sought to use those powers would have no kind of legal argument at all to enforce that power. It doesn't exist. Whereas I can imagine a number of arguments that a government might even use today to say that they can use those powers. Number one, that power exists in the Constitution. Number two, there is no convention against my use of that power. Number three, if there is a convention, there's nothing that says that a power cannot be revived in certain circumstances. And so a court would have to deal with all of that. And then a court would have to say, as they did in the patriation reference, well, even if we recognize a convention, we won't enforce that convention. That becomes itself a political dynamic which we pass over to political actors. That is, the courts, in the one big convention case that I can think of, drew a sharp divide between law and politics. And so in a number of places in your talk, you seem to suggest that we can think of these as synonyms, informal and formal amendments, whereas I see a world of difference.
Thank you for your points, Professor Adams. I think you're absolutely quite right, especially in your reference to the Supreme Court's reference in the early 1980s. The court actually did say, you're right, there may be a convention, but we can't enforce that. We can enforce what is written. My sense, though, is that there are really significant political costs that a provincial legislature, I guess, would entail. The federal government, rather, would incur in invalidating or disallowing or reserving a provincial law. Now, that's not sufficient to make the claim that political costs then mean that it's unconstitutional. Those are political costs. And it may be costly today as a matter of the status of Canadian political, the climate rather, but it may not be costly tomorrow. And I think this points to the question about how conventions change. So today it may be conventional to say that these powers have been, are now obsolete, but tomorrow they may not be. The courts have really no role in enforcing these conventions. They're more enforced in the political process. So I think you're right. I will need to think more about this distinction between law and politics, which I seem to elide over. I seem to blur that distinction. Do you have any suggestions about how to attack this problem?
Well, I think you're right. At least in the jurisprudence, the court suggests that that's a fairly sharp divide. That which is legal and constitutional may not be politically legitimate. So I noticed a number of your claims about non-authentic clauses is that scholars would say, well, it may be politically legitimate. And that may be so. That doesn't speak at all to its legality. It's a constitutional provision. So I don't think there's any real, there may not even be a relation between high political costs and constitutionality. So that's just something to really talk about.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, however, whether what is legal is simply just not what is political, but prosecuted in a different realm. The law is legitimate only because it has political support from political actors. This is, Hart's rule of recognition, right? So I wonder if maybe the distinction between law and politics is not as sharp as you intended, as you say it is, but also not as blurry as I think it is. So maybe somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Say, well, there's a convention on substantial provincial consent. Well, Quebec didn't agree with that convention. And in the veto reference, they say, well, that's not the convention.
Yeah.
It's something else entirely. And so the problem when you move into the world of extra legal constitutional amendment is that you don't have the clarity of the text. You're always in a soupy, messy world in which people and parties may disagree with one another about what the rules of the game are.
Yeah. Your point also raises a fascinating question about where this theory of desuetude can be useful. So it wouldn't be useful, for example, in regimes that are governed by a sham constitution, where we know, for example, that what is written in the text does not really reflect how power is actually constrained. So scholars have observed this phenomenon, although they haven't really, they've just mentioned it in passing. So one scholar, Alex Stone-Sweet, has observed that there's a provision in the French Constitution of 1958 that has not been used many, many times and that may fall into what he calls disuse. This is a provision that authorizes the Conseil Constitutionnel to intervene into the legislative process when there's a stalemate. The court doesn't do that. So Stone-Sweet says, well, maybe this is an obsolete provision. There's also been an observation made by Theo Lee An as to the Singaporean Constitution. So the Singaporean Constitution provides for kind of token representation from opposition parties. So you can appoint what is called a non-constituency member of parliament. That had not been done for decades, even though the Constitution authorized it. Now, I think there's a difference between looking at the concept of desuetude vis-a-vis France versus vis-a-vis Singapore. France is a liberal democracy, constitutional democracy. We know that the text actually binds and constrains action by political actors. We can't say the same thing for other countries, like, for example, maybe Singapore, which is a one-party state that is not regarded as a democracy. So I think your point about the relationship between law and politics also has applications to where the theory actually works, if it works at all. So thank you very, very much.
Hi, thanks. That was a really great talk. I'm Judy Garber. I teach in the political science department here. I guess I want to put out a comment and then ask a question. I think that, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, and you've already talked about it, but I really think the comparison between American Article 5 and Canadian Section 33 is pretty close. And I think it was Sandy Levinson you were quoting who said, you know, it's real hard to amend the U.S. Constitution. Well, you know what? First of all, it's real hard to amend the Canadian Constitution as well. But, you know, it's real hard politically to structurally and politically to use Section 33. So, you know, to me, it's very similar. But the question I have is about your definition of desuetude. And I wonder, and I want to be careful here, but the definition is so narrow, and you found so few instances in the Canadian Constitution and in the U.S. Constitution, which is a really old constitution, that I wonder whether your definition is so narrow that what you're actually talking about is reservation and disallowance and not desuetude.
Okay, yes. Let me just respond to your comment first about the relationship between Article 5 and Section 33. I think that's absolutely right. The thought of using Article 5 in the United States really doesn't occur to political actors as a serious matter. Whenever you see a proposal to amend the U.S. Constitution introduced by a member of Congress, it's usually to speak to parochial local interests, to say, look, I'm doing something, I'm trying to do something, but they know that it's not going to make it through a committee, it's not going to make it out of either house of the Congress.
Well, flag burning would be the, you know, a non-parochial effort.
Sure. And maybe one could argue that proposed amendments reversing the Citizens United rule is different, is in that category as well. But I think they're few and far between, and maybe those are the ones that they prove, the exceptions that prove the rule. You mentioned Sanford Levinson, and he argues, he borrows from Donald Lutz, who argues that the U.S. Constitution is among the most difficult, if not the most difficult constitution to formally amend in the world. And Donald Lutz developed a study that he issued in 1994 and then reissued, updated in 2006, in which he ranked Western liberal democracies with respect to the difficulty of formal amendment. And the U.S. Constitution was at the top, so it's the most difficult presidentialist constitution out there to amend. Now, what's interesting is Canada was not on this list. To go back to your question, Canada was not in the study. Donald Lutz did not include Canada in his study of about 32 or 33 countries because he found it difficult, I think with good reason, to figure out what is the Canadian Constitution. So what do we speak of in Canada when we speak of the Constitution? Do we speak of the 1867 Act? Do we speak of the 1982 Act? Do we speak of the whole list of items that are in the schedule in the chart in the 1982 Act, the 50 or so documents that comprise the Canadian Constitution, including the Statute of Westminster? So for those reasons, he didn't include Canada in his study. But I think that's telling in a couple of ways. One, I suspect that had he included Canada and found a good way to identify what he means by the Canadian Constitution, I suspect that Canada would have been up there, maybe first or second, as far as the most difficult constitutions to formally amend. And second, we should recognize, of course, that the Canadian Constitution has been amended, formally amended, though not by the unanimity formula, which I think is just almost impossible to imagine we would ever use here. But it has been used with the general amending formula, the 750 rule. That was used once, like a year or two right after the coming into force of the Constitution Act 1982. It's also been used with the bilateral formula and the some but not all formula. So the idea that the Part 5 of the Constitution Act 1982 has not ever been used, I think I just want to be clear that it has been used. It's just few and far between. Now, your real point about maybe the paper is just about reservation and disallowance. Maybe that's all it is, and that's a function of the narrowness of the definition of desuetude. I think that's an interesting question. I'm going to think more about that. My initial response, maybe for obvious reasons, is to say no. But I'm going to think more about that. And what persuades me that it may be a paper about more than just reservation and disallowance is that I'm finding more and more examples around the world in constitutions where this actually may apply. So I'm finding examples. So I've listed a few from the U.S. Constitution. There are reasons why I don't think they are, but that may be because I'm approaching this more conservatively. I think a case could be made that Declaration of War Clause has in fact been informally amended out of the Constitution. There's something about, for example, the treaty-making power in the United States. So to pass a treaty in the United States, the president signs it, he or she signs it, and then the Senate must ratify it by 2/3. Well, in American history, modern American history, there have been fewer and fewer treaties that have actually been ratified by the U.S. Senate because the president doesn't operate that way. The president doesn't enter the U.S. into treaties. The president enters the U.S. into sole executive agreements. So this has been a modification to the practice of signing on to treaties. The president has himself, herself, informally amended the Constitution to find other ways of engaging the U.S. in multilateral instruments precisely because of the obstruction that he or she faces in the U.S. Senate. I think one can make an argument that the treaty clause is subject to desuetude. So my initial answer, Professor Garber, is I think it's about more than reservation and disallowance. And as I continue to develop the idea, I'd love to send you the paper and see if I can convince you that that's the case.
And I didn't mean to suggest that it was only, that this is not an interesting concept or that it was only about that, but just that, you know, that it's a very interesting concept, just that, you know, if there are so few examples, then, you know, what are the examples? Thanks.
Yeah, your point is a great point, and it's gonna challenge me to think a bit harder about the definition.
Yes, I have a comment. Maybe you would care to respond. Just a keen student of Canadian history, looking at reservation and disallowance and concerned with fundamental rights, would say, yes, it's probably a good thing Canada had that power, that the federal government had that power. You look at a number of highly questionable pieces of legislation that were enacted, particularly coming out of the Great Depression. The Mackenzie-King government did disallow some of the Eberhart government's legislation here in this province, and it was reintroduced. The press bill is a perfect example of legislation that was, again, questionable, interfered with freedom of the press, and the Supreme Court found that it was unconstitutional. Similarly, the padlock law from Quebec. Now, McKing did not choose to exercise the disallowance power, but for 3 decades that meant there was serious infringement on freedom of expression and association. Frank Scott, the great constitutional scholar, taught his class the shortcomings of bills like that, and got to argue that case. So I would say that perhaps because we now have a Charter of Rights and human rights legislation, we no longer the federal government no longer needs to use that power. I would think you could work that into an argument that we should accord great respect to the Charter, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, we're not going to see the removal of the Charter from the Constitution, but of course there's an ongoing struggle to accord it, a certain level of respect, as some political actors simply don't wish to. So I don't know if you feel that there's any connection that you would comment on.
I do. I think that's an important observation. That's not to say, however, that so the way I interpret your point is that we now have other ways of achieving the ends that we once achieved using reservation and disallowance. I do think that there are important expressive functions that are served by having the reservation and disallowance power still in the text of the Constitution, even though today they may be obsolete. One, I think it tells us about who we are here in Canada. We're a strong, decentralized country. We respect provincial rights, maybe more so today than in the past. I think that's important to express. But I think we have this nice safety net, though, that we don't need to use reservation and disallowance. One, because it's politically illegitimate, or so I argue. But we have this safety net in 2 ways. One, we can challenge provincial legislation using the Charter as our sword. But 2, the federal government, as I mentioned in the short talk, the federal government can still kind of fight provinces and take them to task for laws that they believe should be disallowed or reserved at the very least, and that's by using the reference procedure. So I take your point. We've found other ways of achieving what we once achieved using reservation and disallowance. That's an important point.
I just had a question about the concept of disuse for amending formulas, and it's been suggested that maybe amending formulas in our Constitution or in the American Constitution could fall away because they're not used. But I guess my thought would be, are we not, every time we attempt to use them, every time we discuss using them, in fact using them? I mean, it sets up a series of hoops that you have to jump through. Yeah. Granted, getting through all those hoops successfully is very difficult, but every time we attempt to, even though we may fail, we are using those provisions. And I think that's an important distinction. Yeah. Is it successful use or just use? And I would think that it's not fallen into disuse until there comes a time where we simply don't regard them as relevant, we don't even bother trying. They are not thought of as the applicable rules. As long as we are thinking them as being applicable, just not successfully using them, they are still in use, are they not?
Precisely. I agree 100% with that. And that's one of the reasons that led me to conclude that Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution is not, in fact, obsolete. Political actors at all levels of government, at the state level, at the federal level, they refer to Article 5 and they have designs of using it to achieve what they believe are noble ends. And so even the unsuccessful use, invocation of Article 5, I think is still a use of it. It still gives it an effect insofar as it's still out there in public discussion, in the public discourse. Absolutely. Now, the difficulty that poses, however, is how do we distinguish between authentic and inauthentic uses of a certain power, namely Article 5 here, or Part 5 of the Canadian Constitution Act, for example, of 1982. What's an authentic and an inauthentic use? So, would you consider it a use of the power to amend the Constitution formally if you were to invoke the power, but to invoke it in a way that you knew had no future success. You knew what you were just doing for political reasons, small political reasons, namely to speak to your base in your local constituency, or just to show your constituency that you're actually trying to do stuff in Congress by proposing an amendment. The reason I raise this distinction is because there have literally been over 10,000 proposals to amend the U.S. Constitution since 1789, literally over 10,000. Only 27 have ever succeeded. 10 of those were in one shot, the Bill of Rights that came in 1791. One of those has been repealed by a subsequent amendment. So the 18th Amendment that imposed prohibition was repealed by the 21st, which invalidated prohibition. The most recent amendment, the 27th, was ratified in 1992 after having first been proposed in 1789. So it took over 200 years to ratify that thing. Very interesting, that history of the 27th Amendment, which, by the way, provides that Congress can't raise its own salaries without first having an intervening election to go to the polls for the people to bless that change. So we're down from 27 to 17 to 16 to 15. There's something about the infrequency of using Article 5 in the U.S. that suggests to me there's something going on. But your point is still quite valid, which is when it's used in political discourse, it's still having an effect, even if we know that it's not going to lead to a successful Article 5 amendment. Absolutely. My difficulty, though, is in trying to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic, and also to ask whether it even matters to distinguish between the two. I could imagine you saying, well, it doesn't matter. Who cares what the purpose is for which one is invoking Article 5 in Congress, either for local, parochial, or universal, national aims? Who cares? As long as it's being discussed and raised, it still has some legitimacy for at least one person, one political actor, and that's all we need. So I'm still struggling with this, but thank you for raising that.